The Roman bathhouse was the cleanest place in the ancient world. It was also, by a considerable margin, the most efficient mechanism for spreading disease that the Roman Empire had yet devised. These two facts are not in contradiction. They are, in fact, the same fact, viewed from different angles. The Romans built the thermae, their great public baths, with engineering sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. They heated the water, heated the floors, heated the walls, and created an environment of warmth and moisture that was, for a Roman citizen, the closest available approximation to comfort. They also created, without understanding what they were creating, an ideal incubation environment for every waterborne and airborne pathogen that the population of a city of 1 million people was capable of producing. The Romans went to the baths to get clean. The baths, in return, gave them things they had not asked for. Several of those things could kill you. Stotakoe thermae. The great imperial thermae of Rome were not bathhouses in any sense that the word carries today. They were cities within a city. The Baths of Caracalla, completed in 216 AD, and among the largest surviving examples, covered approximately 13 hectares, roughly the area of 25 football fields, and could accommodate somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 bathers simultaneously. The baths of Diocletian were larger still, with a capacity estimated at 3,000 bathers at any given time in the main bathing halls alone. These were not facilities you visited primarily to wash. They were the social center of Roman urban life, the place where business was conducted, gossip exchanged, philosophers heard, athletes trained, and food consumed, all in the same building on the same afternoon. Seneca, the philosopher, lived above a bathhouse and complained in a letter that the noise was intolerable. The splash of the pool, the grunts of the wrestlers, the hawking of the food sellers, the screaming of men having their armpit hair plucked. He described it with the weary precision of a man who has tried and failed to concentrate through a significant amount of other people's enjoyment. The baths were not quiet. They were not empty. And they were not, despite everything the Romans believed about them, making anyone significantly cleaner. Stoimist vchoda iktotambil. Entry to the public thermae cost 1 quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, worth approximately 1/4 of an ass, which itself was worth approximately 1/16 of a day's wages for an unskilled laborer. In practical terms, admission to the baths cost approximately nothing. Children entered free. On days when a wealthy patron or an emperor was feeling generous, and emperors discovered early that free bath days were an extremely cost-effective form of public relations, admission was free for everyone. This meant that the baths were genuinely, unusually, remarkably democratic by the standards of the ancient world. A senator and a slave could, and did, use the same pools. A general and a dock worker occupied the same warm room. A wealthy merchant and a beggar who had scraped together his quadrans shared the same water. The Romans were proud of this. It was, in many ways, an admirable social institution. It was also, from an epidemiological perspective, a mechanism for ensuring that every pathogen present in Rome's population had maximum opportunity to encounter every other member of Rome's population in the most favorable possible conditions for transmission. Democracy has its costs. Последовательность бань. The standard Roman bathing sequence moved through a series of rooms of increasing temperature, each with a specific Latin name and a specific function that the Romans had developed over centuries of empirical refinement. You began in the apoditerium, the changing room, where you left your clothes and, if you were wise, arranged for a slave or a trusted companion to guard them, since theft in the apoditerium was sufficiently common that Roman satirists made jokes about it, and Roman lawyers had developed a body of case law around it. From the apoditerium, you moved to the tepidarium, the warm room, where the temperature was moderate and the purpose was acclimatization. Then the caldarium, the hot room, where a pool of hot water and a labrum, a large basin of cool water for splashing the face, occupied the main space. Then, optionally, the laconicum, a dry heat room similar to a modern sauna, where temperatures could reach levels that the Romans found invigorating and modern health and safety regulations would find noteworthy. Then back through the tepidarium to the frigidarium, the cold room, with its cold plunge pool that the Romans believed closed the pores and completed the bathing process. The sequence was logical, pleasurable, and conducted in rooms that, by the end of a busy afternoon, contained the accumulated biological contribution of several thousand people who had passed through them since morning. The Romans scraped their skin with a curved metal tool called a strigil, rather than using soap, which did not exist in its modern form. The strigil removed sweat, oil and dirt from the skin and deposited it into the water. The water was then used by the next bather, and the next, and the next. The water in the Roman thermae was not changed between bathers. This is the central fact around which everything else in this video is organized, and it requires a moment to fully absorb. The pools of the caldarium and frigidarium were filled in the morning and used throughout the day by however many bathers the facility could accommodate. At the Baths of Caracalla, that number was somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people. The water that the last bather of the afternoon entered was the same water, warmed and topped up but not replaced, that the first bather of the morning had entered. It contained the sweat, skin cells, body oil, strigil scrapings, and whatever else several thousand human bodies had contributed to it over the course of a day. It was warm. It was wet. It was, in microbiological terms, a remarkably rich growth medium. The Romans, who had no concept of germ theory and no microscope with which to investigate the water's contents, found it perfectly acceptable. Several Roman physicians noted that people who used the baths frequently seemed to suffer from eye infections, skin conditions, and gastrointestinal complaints at rates that they attributed to the humoral imbalances produced by excessive heat. The diagnosis was wrong. The observation was completely accurate.
Сцена 6. Что жило в воде?
The parasitological evidence from Roman bath sites is, by the standards of ancient history, unusually direct. Archaeologists excavating latrine deposits at Roman sites across Europe, Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall, Sagalassos in Turkey, sites across Italy, have found evidence of intestinal parasites, including whipworm, roundworm, and Entamoeba histolytica, the organism responsible for amoebic dysentery, in concentrations that suggest Roman sanitation, for all its engineering sophistication, was not achieving what the Romans believed it was achieving. A study published in the journal Parasitology in 2016 examined the archaeological evidence for intestinal parasites in Roman Britain and found that rates of infection with soil-transmitted helminths were comparable to, or higher than, rates in the pre-Roman period, despite the Romans introducing aqueducts, sewers, and public baths. The researchers noted this with what reads as genuine surprise. The Romans had built infrastructure specifically designed to improve sanitation. The infrastructure had not improved sanitation. It had, in some respects, made it worse by concentrating large numbers of people in shared water facilities and by creating the warm, moist conditions in which certain parasites thrived particularly well. The aqueducts delivered clean water to the city, By the time that water had been used by 6,000 people, it was delivering something considerably less clean to the person currently standing in it. Scena 7. Latrine. The Roman public latrine, the forica, was typically located adjacent to or within the bathhouse complex, because the water used to clean the baths was also used to flush the latrines. The forica was a long room with stone benches running along the walls, cut with holes at regular intervals over a channel of running water that flushed the waste away. There were no individual stalls. There were no doors. Roman men sat side by side on the latrine benches and conducted conversations, conducted business, and in some documented cases conducted philosophical discussions while doing what they had come to do. A sponge on a stick, the xylospongium, was shared between users for personal hygiene, rinsed in a channel of running water between uses. The Romans considered this hygienic. From the perspective of Escherichia coli, it was generous. The channel of water that flushed the latrine ran in many Roman cities directly into the same system that eventually supplied water to the baths. The engineering that made Roman sanitation remarkable was also the engineering that connected its waste disposal system to its personal hygiene system in ways that the Romans had not fully thought through. The water moved in the right direction most of the time. Most of the time was not all of the time. Scena 8. Vozduch. The air inside the Roman thermae was not only warm and moist, it was crowded. The caldarium of a major bathhouse on a busy afternoon contained hundreds of people breathing, sweating, and exhaling in a room heated to temperatures that modern research has estimated at between 40 and 60 degrees Celsius. Roman physicians were aware that the air in crowded spaces was associated with disease. The concept of miasma, bad air, was the standard theoretical explanation for epidemic illness, and the baths were sometimes cited as a source of harmful vapors. They were correct that something in the air of the baths was causing illness. They were wrong about what it was. The warm, moist air of the caldarium was not dangerous because it was inherently corrupted. It was dangerous because it was an ideal medium for the airborne transmission of respiratory pathogens, including tuberculosis, which archaeological evidence suggests was endemic in Roman urban populations, among hundreds of people in close proximity. Celsus, the Roman medical writer, recommended the baths as a treatment for numerous conditions, including fevers and respiratory complaints. Sending a patient with a respiratory complaint to sit in a warm, crowded room, breathing the exhalations of several hundred other people, is not, by modern standards, considered optimal therapeutic advice. Celsus did not have access to modern standards. His patients did not benefit from this limitation. The area immediately surrounding a Roman bathhouse was, by the standards of the ancient city, one of its more commercially active neighborhoods. Food vendors set up stalls at the entrance, selling sausages, bread, and cooked food to bathers arriving and departing. The food was prepared in the open air of a Roman city street, which is to say, it was prepared in close proximity to the open drains that ran along the edges of Roman roads, carrying a mixture of rainwater, household waste, and animal dung toward the main sewer. The flies that moved between the food stalls and the drains were doing what flies do, which is to say, they were doing it efficiently and without regard for the preferences of the people whose food they were visiting. A Roman bather who had spent 2 hours in a pool of recycled bathwater used the shared sponge in the forica and then purchased a sausage from a street vendor outside, had experienced, in the space of an afternoon, a fairly comprehensive tour of the Roman city's disease transmission infrastructure. He felt clean. He had been to the baths. The baths were where you went to get clean. The logic was impeccable. The outcome was not always consistent with the logic. Cetum detia. Perivarot stereotypa. The most important reversal of expectation in the history of Roman bathing is the one that the archaeological and medical evidence has produced in the last 30 years of scholarship.
The Romans are celebrated, correctly, for their engineering, the aqueducts that delivered clean water, the sewers that removed waste, the thermae that provided hygiene infrastructure to a population of 1 million people. The assumption embedded in this celebration is that the infrastructure worked, that it made Rome a healthier city than it would otherwise have been. The parasitological evidence suggests this assumption is, at minimum, significantly overstated. Rome, despite its aqueducts and sewers and public baths, had intestinal parasite infection rates comparable to medieval European cities that had none of these things. The engineering that should have made Rome healthier had, by concentrating people in shared water and creating warm, moist environments ideal for pathogen survival, partially offset its own benefits. The Romans built the most sophisticated public health infrastructure of the ancient world. They used it in ways that partially undermined its purpose. They did not know this. They went to the baths every day, feeling clean and civilized, and superior to the barbarians who did not have baths. The barbarians, who drank from rivers and bathed in cold streams, had comparable rates of intestinal parasites. Nobody came out of this looking particularly good. The numbers associated with Roman bathing culture are numbers that the Romans recorded with the pride of a civilization that considered its baths one of its defining achievements. At its peak, the city of Rome had somewhere between 900 and 1,000 public baths of varying sizes, from the great imperial thermae to smaller neighborhood facilities called balnea. The Regionary Catalogues of the 4th century AD list 856 balnea in the city. The aqueducts supplying Rome delivered approximately 1 million cubic meters of water per day to the city, enough to supply the baths, the fountains, the private households of the wealthy, and the public latrines. The Baths of Caracalla required approximately 16 million litres of water per day to operate at full capacity. The engineering required to deliver this water, the aqueducts stretching hundreds of kilometres, the distribution pipes of lead and terracotta, the heating systems beneath the bath floors, represented a capital investment that no other ancient civilization matched, and that medieval Europe would not approach for over 1,000 years. The investment was real, the engineering was genuinely impressive. The health outcomes it produced were, by the measure of intestinal parasite rates, somewhat disappointing. The Romans would have been surprised by this assessment. They would also have been surprised by the concept of intestinal parasites, since they did not know what intestinal parasites were. Ignorance in this case was not bliss. It was just ignorance. To survive your 24 hours in a Roman bathhouse in 100 AD, you would have needed to avoid the shared pool water, avoid the shared sponge, avoid the crowded caldarium during peak hours, avoid the food vendors outside, and avoid spending any significant time in a warm, enclosed space with several hundred people breathing on you. You would have needed, in other words, to not use the bathhouse. This would have made you an object of social concern to your Roman neighbours, for whom daily bathing was not a luxury, but a social obligation. The person who did not go to the baths was the person who had something to hide, or something wrong with them, or simply insufficient regard for the standards of civilized life. The baths were civilization. To avoid them was to opt out of civilization. The Romans who went every day, who sat in the warm pools and scraped their skin with strigils and discussed philosophy and conducted business and felt, as they emerged clean and pink into the afternoon air, the particular satisfaction of a society that had solved the problem of hygiene.
Those Romans were not wrong to feel that satisfaction. They had built something extraordinary. They had built it with great skill and considerable expense. They had then used it in ways that partially defeated its own purpose, in complete good faith, without any means of knowing what they were doing. The water they stepped out of was warmer than the water they had stepped in. It was also considerably more interesting, biologically speaking, than it had been that morning. They went home feeling clean. The parasites went with them. Everyone had had a good afternoon.